The desert wind carried nothing but dust and despair across the parched lands of Arizona Territory in the summer of 1883. The sun hung mercilessly in a bleached sky, baking the red earth until it cracked like broken pottery. In the distance, the small settlement of Bitter Creek squatted against the horizon, its weathered buildings testament to the harsh reality of frontier life. Inside a ramshackle cabin on the outskirts of town, 18-year-old Clara Mason pressed her face against the grimy window, watching tumbleweeds dance across the barren yard. Her father's voice, rough as sandpaper from years of whiskey and disappointment, cut through the stifling afternoon air. "Ain't no use moping, girl. What's done is done." Thomas Mason sat hunched over the wooden table, counting coins with trembling fingers. Each clink of metal seemed to echo the family's dwindling fortunes. The drought had killed their crops for the third year running, and the cattle, what few remained, were little more than walking skeletons. Clara's mother, Margaret, sat in the corner, her once pretty face drawn and hollow. She clutched a threadbare shawl around her shoulders despite the oppressive heat, as if trying to hold together the fragments of her shattered dignity. Her eyes, red-rimmed from crying, darted between her husband and daughter like a trapped animal's. "There must be another way, Thomas," Margaret whispered, her voice barely audible above the creaking of the cabin's sun-warped boards. "She's our only child." Thomas slammed his fist on the table, sending coins scattering. "Another way? You see another way? Woman, the bank's breathing down our necks. We got no crops, no money, and winter's coming whether we're ready or not." Clara turned from the window, her hazel eyes flashing with a mixture of fear and defiance. She'd heard the whispers in town, seen the way the other families looked at them with pity and disdain. The Masons had fallen far from their modest respectability, and everyone knew it. "What are you planning, Pa?" she asked, though something cold in her stomach told her she already knew. Thomas avoided her gaze, focusing instead on gathering the scattered coins. "Man came by yesterday. Apache. Lives alone up in the Dragoon Mountains. He's got horses, good ones, strong enough to pull a plow or carry supplies. Indians don't trade horses for nothing," Clara said slowly, her heart beginning to pound. "No," Thomas agreed, finally meeting her eyes. "They don't." The silence that followed was deafening. Margaret let out a soft sob, burying her face in her hands. Clara felt the blood drain from her face as understanding dawned. "You wouldn't," she breathed. "Pa, you couldn't." "It's already arranged," Thomas said flatly. "He'll be here before sundown." Clara stumbled backward, her legs suddenly weak. "I'm your daughter. How could you even think—" "You're 18, Thomas interrupted, his voice hard as flint. "Old enough to be married off anyway. At least this way. We get something out of it. That horse could mean the difference between surviving the winter and starving." "A horse," Clara repeated numbly. "You're trading me for a horse." Margaret finally found her voice, though it came out as little more than a whimper. "The Apache. He didn't seem cruel. He spoke some English. Said he'd treat her proper." "Proper?" Clara laughed bitterly. "Living with a savage in the mountains? You call that proper? Watch your tongue, girl," Thomas warned. "It's done. You'll go willing, or I'll tie you to that horse myself." Clara looked desperately at her mother, searching for any sign of protection, of maternal love strong enough to stand against this madness. But Margaret only wept silently, too broken by years of hardship to fight anymore. As the sun began its descent toward the jagged mountain peaks, painting the sky in shades of blood and amber, the sound of approaching hoofbeats made Clara's heart race. She rushed to the window and saw him, a lone figure on horseback, leading another mount behind him. The Apache was younger than she'd expected, perhaps 30 summers, with long black hair tied back and skin bronzed by the desert sun. He wore a mixture of traditional dress and white man's clothing, leather leggings, a cotton shirt, and a wide-brimmed hat that shadowed his face. He moved with the fluid grace of someone completely at home in this unforgiving landscape. Thomas went out to meet him, and Clara watched through the window as they spoke in low tones. The Apache's face remained impassive, but his dark eyes swept toward the cabin, seeming to see through the walls to where she stood trembling. "Clara," Margaret whispered, approaching her daughter with shaking hands. "Take this." She pressed something small and hard into Clara's palm. Her mother's wedding ring, worn thin by years of toil. "Ma, no. Hush, child. Maybe you can trade it for something, food or passage back. If—" Margaret couldn't finish the sentence, couldn't voice the terrible possibilities that lay ahead. The door opened, and Thomas stood silhouetted against the dying light. "Come on out, Clara. Time to go." Clara's legs felt like water, but somehow she forced herself to walk. Each step took her closer to the door, closer to the end of everything she'd known. The Apache waited by his horses, patient as stone. Up close, she could see his features more clearly. His face was angular, marked by a thin scar along one cheek. His eyes, she discovered, weren't black but a deep brown, like rich earth after rain. They regarded her without emotion, taking in her pale skin, her wheat-colored hair twisted in a simple bun, her faded calico dress. "This is her," Thomas said unnecessarily. "She's strong, knows how to work, can cook, clean, whatever you need." The Apache nodded once, then spoke, his English accented but clear. "The horse, as agreed." He handed the reins of the spare mount to Thomas, who took them with eager hands, already calculating what the animal might bring him. Clara watched this transaction, her life exchanged for livestock, with a growing sense of unreality. "Please," she said suddenly, not sure who she was addressing. "Please, Enough," Thomas cut her off sharply. "You belong to him now." Those words hit Clara like a physical blow. You belong to him now. Like she was property. Like she was no more than the horse changing hands. The Apache approached her slowly, as one might approach a spooked animal. From a leather pouch at his side, he produced a length of soft rope. Clara's eyes widened in panic, but he merely fashioned it into a lead, attaching one end to his horse's saddle and offering her the other end to hold. "For safety," he said quietly. "Mountains are treacherous in darkness." Clara looked back at the cabin one last time. Her mother stood in the doorway, a ghostly figure backlit by the oil lamp inside. Her father was already leading his new horse toward the barn, not even watching as his only child was led away. "Ma!" Clara called out, tears streaming down her face. Margaret took a step forward, then stopped, held back by years of submission to her husband's will. "Be strong, Clara!" she called, her voice breaking. "Be strong." The Apache mounted his horse in one fluid motion, then looked down at Clara expectantly. She realized he meant for her to walk, at least until they were away from the settlement. Her hands shaking, she gripped the rope and began to follow as he urged his mount forward. The last thing Clara heard as they left Bitter Creek behind was her mother's muffled sobs carrying on the desert wind. Then there was only the sound of hoofbeats on hard-packed earth and the whisper of her own voice, repeating like a prayer or a curse. "At 18, I was traded to a solitary Apache for a horse." The words tasted like ashes in her mouth, bitter as the alkali dust that rose with each step into her new life. A life that waited in the purple shadows of the mountains, as unknown and fearsome as the silent man who now held her fate in his weathered hands. As darkness began to swallow the desert, Clara stumbled along behind the horses, her thin shoes already wearing through from the rough ground. She didn't look back again. There was nothing left to see but the grave of her old life. And ahead, only the endless night and the incomprehensible future that awaited her in the arms of a stranger who had bought her for the price of a horse. The moon rose like a silver coin over the jagged peaks of the Dragoon Mountains, casting eerie shadows across the desert floor. Clara's feet burned with each step, her thin shoes offering little protection against the sharp rocks and thorny vegetation that littered their path. She had been walking for what felt like hours, though time had lost meaning in this vast emptiness. The Apache, she still didn't know his name, rode ahead in silence, his figure dark against the star-scattered sky. Occasionally, he would glance back, checking that she still followed. But he offered no words of comfort or explanation. The rope between them stretched taut, a physical reminder of her new reality. When Clara stumbled for the third time, her knees scraping against the unforgiving ground, he finally halted his horse. In one smooth motion, he dismounted and approached her. Clara instinctively shrank back, but exhaustion had stolen most of her strength to resist. "You ride now," he said simply, gesturing to his horse. Clara looked up at the animal, a painted mare with intelligent eyes, and shook her head. I don't know how. We never had horses for riding, only for work." He studied her for a moment, then moved closer. Clara's heart hammered as he reached for her, but his hands were surprisingly gentle as he helped her to her feet. The contrast between his careful touch and her father's rough handling wasn't lost on her. "I will teach," he said, leading her to the horse. "But first, we rest." He guided her to a cluster of large boulders that provided some shelter from the cool night wind. From his saddlebags, he produced a water skin and handed it to her. Clara drank greedily, not realizing until that moment how parched her throat had become. As she drank, she studied him in the moonlight. The scar on his cheek seemed less harsh now, more like a story written on his skin than a mark of violence. His movements were economical, purposeful, unpacking a blanket, checking the horses, scanning the horizon for danger. "What is your name?" Clara asked suddenly, surprising herself with the question. He paused in his activities, seeming to consider whether to answer. "I am called Samuel," he said finally. "Samuel Crowfeather." "Samuel," she repeated, tasting the familiar Christian name. "That's not, my father was white," he said without emotion. "Missionary. My mother, Apache." He resumed his tasks, clearly considering the conversation closed. Clara wrapped her arms around herself, shivering as the desert's nighttime chill set in. Samuel noticed and tossed her the blanket he'd unpacked. It smelled of smoke and leather and something wild she couldn't name. "We reach my home tomorrow," he said, settling himself against a boulder. "Sleep now." "I can't sleep," Clara said, her voice small. "How do I know you won't?" Samuel's eyes met hers across the small space between them. "I traded for a wife, not a captive. You are under my protection now. No harm comes to you." The simple declaration should have meant nothing. Promises from men had proven worthless in Clara's experience. But something in his steady gaze, in the matter-of-fact way he spoke, made her believe him. Still, sleep was impossible. She sat huddled in the blanket, watching the stars wheel overhead and listening to the alien sounds of the desert night. The distant howl of coyotes, the rustle of small creatures in the brush, the whisper of wind through stone, when dawn painted the eastern sky in shades of rose and gold. They resumed their journey. True to his word, Samuel helped Clara onto his horse, showing her how to grip the mane, how to move with the animal rather than against it. He walked alongside, leading the pack horse, seemingly tireless despite the long night. The landscape changed as they climbed higher into the mountains. The sparse desert vegetation gave way to juniper and pinon pine. The air grew cooler, scented with resin and earth. Clara had never seen such wild beauty, towering red rock formations that looked like ancient castles, deep canyons that seemed to plunge to the center of the earth, eagles circling on thermal currents high above. "It's magnificent," she breathed, momentarily forgetting her circumstances in the face of such grandeur. Samuel glanced up at her, and she thought she saw approval in his eyes. "The land is strong here. It teaches us to be strong too." They stopped at midday by a small spring that bubbled from the rocks. Samuel produced dried meat and flat bread from his supplies, sharing them with Clara. The meat was tough and salty, nothing like the beef she was used to, but hunger made it palatable. "Your family," Clara ventured, emboldened by his earlier revelations. "Do they live near your home?" "No family," Samuel said curtly. "Only me. But your mother, dead many years." His tone discouraged further questions. Clara fell silent, wondering at the loneliness of his existence. A man truly alone in these mountains, with no clan, no people. What had driven him to trade a valuable horse for a wife he'd never met? As if reading her thoughts, Samuel spoke again. A man needs someone. The silence. It becomes too loud. The profound simplicity of that statement struck Clara. She thought of her own family's cabin, crowded and tense with unspoken resentments, and wondered if there were different kinds of loneliness. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as they climbed a narrow trail that wound between towering cliff faces. Clara clung to the horse's mane, trying not to look down at the dizzying drops on either side. Samuel moved with sure-footed confidence, occasionally speaking soft words to the horses in his native tongue, just as Clara thought she could endure no more. They crested a ridge and she gasped. Below them lay a small valley, hidden like a secret in the heart of the mountains. A stream ran through it, feeding a grove of cottonwoods and willows. Against the far cliff face, she could make out a structure, partly natural cave, partly built with stones and logs. Home, Samuel said simply. As they descended into the valley, Clara felt as if she were leaving the known world behind entirely. This place seemed untouched by civilization, a fragment of the earth as it had been since creation, beautiful and terrifying in equal measure. Samuel's dwelling was more substantial than she'd expected. The natural cave had been extended with carefully constructed walls. A stone fire pit sat outside, blackened by years of use. Various tools and implements hung under a wooden shelter. It was primitive by her standards, but there was an order to it, a sense of purposeful living. He helped her dismount, and Clara's legs nearly buckled after the long ride. Samuel steadied her, his hands strong but gentle on her arms. For a moment, they stood close, and Clara caught his scent, sage and wood smoke and clean sweat. Then he stepped back, busyness himself with the horses. "You rest," he said. "I bring water, make fire." Clara wanted to help. She'd been raised to work after all, but exhaustion overwhelmed her. She sank down on a flat stone near the dwelling and watched as Samuel moved efficiently about his tasks. There was a grace to his movements, a harmony with his surroundings that made her feel clumsy and foreign by comparison. As the sun began its descent behind the western peaks, painting the valley in shades of amber and purple, Samuel built a fire in the stone pit. The smoke rose straight in the still air, and the crackling of burning wood was comforting in its familiarity. He prepared a simple meal, some kind of stew made with dried meat, wild onions, and herbs Clara didn't recognize. It was surprisingly good, and she ate hungrily, aware of his eyes on her as she did. When darkness fell, complete and absolute in a way Clara had never experienced in town, the moment she dreaded arrived. Samuel banked the fire and gestured toward the dwelling. "You sleep inside," he said. "I stay here." Clara blinked in surprise. "You're not—" "When you are ready," he said quietly. "Not before." Relief flooded through her, followed by an unexpected twinge of something else. Disappointment? Surely not. She rose on unsteady legs and made her way to the dwelling. Inside, by the dim light of the dying fire, she could make out a sleeping area covered with furs and woven blankets. It smelled of earth and stone and faintly of the man who lived here. Clara lay down fully clothed, pulling a fur over herself. Through the entrance, she could see Samuel's silhouette as he sat by the fire, keeping watch. In her exhaustion, her last thought was a confused jumble of images. Her mother's tear-stained face, her father counting coins, the vast desert under stars, and the quiet strength of the man who had bought her for a horse, yet asked nothing of her but trust. At 18, she was traded to a solitary Apache for a horse. She whispered into the darkness, the words a talisman against the strangeness of her new world. Outside, an owl called, and the mountains settled into their ancient sleep, indifferent to the small human drama playing out in their shadow. The first week in the mountains passed in a blur of adjustment and small rebellions. Clara woke each morning to find Samuel already at work, tending the fire, checking snares, or repairing tools. He would nod at her arrival but rarely spoke. leaving her to navigate this strange new existence largely on her own. The daily tasks were harder than anything she'd known. Drawing water from the stream meant navigating rocky paths with heavy clay pots. Starting a fire without matches required patience she didn't possess. Even simple cooking became a challenge with unfamiliar ingredients and primitive tools. Her soft hands blistered, her back ached, and more than once she collapsed in frustrated tears. Samuel watched her struggles with an unreadable expression, offering help only when she was truly at risk of harm. It infuriated her, this silent observation, as if she were some creature being tested. "Why don't you just tell me how to do things?" she snapped one afternoon after burning their meal for the second time. "Telling is not learning," he replied calmly. "You must find your own way." "My own way?" Clara laughed bitterly. "My way is back home, not here in this God-forsaken wilderness." "That home sold you for a horse," Samuel reminded her. "Not unkindly. This is home now." The truth of it stung worse than her blistered palms. That night, Clara made her first escape attempt. She waited until Samuel's breathing deepened in sleep. He still slept outside, giving her the shelter, then crept from the dwelling. The moon was new, offering little light, but desperation drove her forward. She made it perhaps a mile down the valley before realizing the futility of her plan. In the darkness, every shadow could hide danger. The trail they'd taken days ago was invisible, and she had no water, no food, no idea which direction led to civilization. Coyotes howled in the distance, their cries raising goosebumps on her skin. A hand fell on her shoulder, and Clara shrieked. "Foolish," Samuel said quietly. He'd approached so silently she hadn't heard a single footfall. "You would die before sunrise." "Maybe that's better," Clara said defiantly, though her voice shook. "Better than living like a savage." His face hardened at the word. Without speaking, he took her arm and led her back to the dwelling. Clara expected anger, punishment, but he simply pointed to her sleeping area and walked away. The next morning, she woke to find a pair of sturdy moccasins beside her bed, along with clothes more suitable for mountain life, a doeskin skirt and cotton blouse. Her own shoes were nearly destroyed, her dress torn and filthy. Pride warred with practicality, and practicality won. The clothes fit well, and the moccasins were more comfortable than any shoes she'd owned. When she emerged, Samuel nodded approval but said nothing. That day, instead of leaving her to struggle alone, he began to teach. He showed her how to bank a fire to keep coals alive through the night, how to identify edible plants from poisonous ones, how to read the sky for weather changes. His hands guided hers as she learned to grind corn on a stone metate, to weave baskets from willow strips, to set snares for small game. "Why didn't you teach me before?" Clara asked as they worked side by side. "You were not ready to learn." Samuel said, "Anger and pride make poor students." Clara wanted to argue but couldn't. Her anger had indeed blinded her to everything but her own misery. Now, as Samuel patiently demonstrated each skill, she began to see the intelligence behind what she dismissed as primitive ways. Everything had purpose here, refined by generations of survival in this harsh land. One evening, as she successfully started a fire with flint and steel on her first try, Samuel smiled, a brief uplift of his scarred cheek that transformed his stern features. "Good," he said simply, but the praise warmed Clara more than the flames. That night, a desert thunderstorm rolled through the valley. Clara huddled in the dwelling as lightning split the sky and rain hammered the earth. The cave remained dry and secure, but the violence of the storm terrified her. In town, she'd had walls and windows between her and nature's fury. Here, only stone and Samuel's construction stood against the elements. A particularly loud thunderclap made her cry out, and suddenly Samuel was there, ducking into the dwelling. Water streamed from his hair and clothes. "The storm frightens you," he observed. "Everything here frightens me," Clara admitted, surprising herself with the honesty. Samuel sat just inside the entrance, maintaining respectful distance. "Fear is wise, but you must learn which fears to heed and which to release. The storm brings life, water for the plants, filling the streams. Without it, the desert dies. As if to prove his point, the rain began to ease, and through the entrance Clara could see moonlight breaking through the clouds. The air smelled clean and alive, perfumed with sage and wet earth. "Tell me about your mother," Clara said impulsively. "You said she was Apache." Samuel was quiet so long she thought he wouldn't answer. Then, "She was medicine woman, knew all the plants, all the old songs. She tried to teach me, but I was young and angry, caught between two worlds, belonging to neither." "What happened to her?" "Soldiers came to move our band to the reservation. She refused to go, said the mountains were our blood and bones. He paused, his jaw tightening. "She died fighting for this land. I was 14. Clara felt a stab of sympathy. "And your father?" "Gone long before, back to his mission, his white god. Left nothing but his name and blue coat that my mother burned." The bitterness in his voice was profound. Clara understood then why he lived alone, why he'd wanted a wife badly enough to trade a precious horse. He was as much an outcast as she now was, rejected by both worlds that had made him. "I'm sorry," she said softly. Samuel looked at her sharply, as if searching for mockery, but found only sincerity. "The past is dead. We live now, or we don't live at all." He left then, returning to his post outside. Clara lay thinking about his words, about the strange parallels in their lives. Both abandoned, both forced to survive in worlds that didn't want them. Perhaps that was why he'd chosen her, sensing a kindred spirit in displacement. Her second escape attempt came 3 days later. Better planned, but equally doomed. This time Samuel caught her trying to saddle the gentler of his horses at dawn. He didn't touch her, just stood watching with those dark, patient eyes. "Where would you go?" he asked quietly. "Your father would sell you again, to someone else, or leave you to starve. Town people would call you ruined. No decent man would have you. Where is this freedom you seek?" The words were cruel in their truth. Clara's hand stilled on the saddle. She had no answer because there was no answer. A woman alone in 1883 had few choices, fewer still if she'd lived with an Apache, willing or not. "I hate you," she whispered, but the words lacked conviction. "No," Samuel said. "You hate the truth. That is different." He helped her unsaddle the horse, and they returned to their daily routine. But something had shifted. Clara's attempts at escape ceased, replaced by a grim determination to master this life she couldn't leave. Samuel seemed to sense the change. That evening, he brought out a small leather pouch and emptied its contents onto a flat stone. Blue and white beads, silver conchos, and delicate shells. "These were my mother's," he said, "for ceremony, for prayer. She would want—" He paused, selecting his words carefully. "A wife should have beautiful things." Clara touched the artifacts gently, moved by the gesture. "I don't know your ceremonies." "Then I teach," Samuel said, "if you wish to learn." "Yes," Clara said, surprising herself again. "I wish to learn." That night, for the first time, Samuel remained in the dwelling after dark. He sat across the fire from her, telling stories of the mountains, how Coyote stole fire for the people, how the stars came to be, why the owl calls at night. His voice was different when he told these tales, softer, carrying the cadence of his mother's tongue. Clara found herself leaning forward, captivated despite herself. When he finished, the fire had burned low, and shadows danced on the stone walls. "My mother would have liked you," Samuel said suddenly. "You have strength, even when afraid. That is Apache way, to face fear, to grow strong from struggle." "I don't feel strong," Clara admitted. "Strength is not in feeling, is in surviving, in learning, in choosing to live when easier to die." He rose, preparing to leave for his usual place outside. "You are stronger than you know. Clara Mason." It was the first time he'd used her name. As he departed, Clara wrapped herself in the fur blankets that smelled of smoke and mountain air. Outside, an owl called, just as in the stories. The sound no longer frightened her. She thought of her father's cruel words. "You belong to him now." Yes, perhaps she did. But maybe, just maybe, that belonging could become something more than ownership. Maybe it could become a choice. The thought should have terrified her. Instead, for the first time since leaving Bitter Creek, Clara slept peacefully through the night. The harsh realities of desert survival revealed themselves with each passing day. A sandstorm swept through the valley without warning, turning the air into a choking wall of grit that found its way into everything: food, water, even the sealed containers Clara had thought secure. She huddled in the dwelling for hours, fabric pressed over her nose and mouth. While outside, Samuel worked to secure their supplies and calm the horses. When the storm finally passed, a thick layer of red dust coated everything. Clara emerged, coughing and spitting, to find their water jars contaminated and half their dried meat ruined. Samuel surveyed the damage with stoic acceptance, already planning their recovery. "We go to the higher spring," he said, gathering the water containers. 3 miles up the mountain. "You come." It wasn't a question. Clara had learned that survival here meant constant work, constant vigilance. She helped load the pack horse and followed Samuel up a treacherous path she hadn't known existed. The trail was barely wide enough for the horses, with a sheer drop on one side that made her stomach clench. At the spring, a crystal-clear pool fed by underground sources, Samuel showed her how to test water for purity, how to spot animal tracks that might indicate danger. As Clara knelt to fill the jars, she glimpsed her reflection and hardly recognized herself. Her skin had darkened from the sun. Her hair hung in a simple braid adorned with a beaded tie Samuel had given her. The soft town girl was disappearing, replaced by someone harder, more capable. "Mountain lion," Samuel said suddenly, pointing to marks in the mud. "Fresh, we leave quickly." The journey back was tense, both of them alert for any sign of the predator. Clara found herself naturally falling into the watchful state Samuel maintained, her eyes scanning the rocks and shadows. When they reached home safely, she felt a surge of accomplishment that surprised her. That evening, as she prepared their meal with increasing competence, disaster struck in the form of her own clumsiness. Reaching for a pot, Clara knocked over the basket containing their remaining cornmeal. It scattered across the ground, immediately ruined by dirt and ash from the fire. "No!" she cried, dropping to her knees to salvage what she could. But it was hopeless. Weeks of food, gone in an instant. She expected anger from Samuel, harsh words or worse. Instead, he knelt beside her and gently stopped her frantic gathering. "Mistakes happen," he said calmly. "We adapt." "But the corn, we need it." "Then we find other food. The desert provides if you know how to ask." He helped her to her feet, his hand lingering on her elbow. "Tomorrow, I show you." True to his word. The next day became a lesson in desert foraging. Samuel led her through the valley and into the surrounding hills, pointing out plants she'd walked past a dozen times without seeing. Prickly pear cactus with its sweet fruit, mesquite pods that could be ground into flour, agave hearts that roasted up tender and nutritious. "Your people see empty land," he explained as they gathered. "My people see a garden. Every plant has purpose, has gift to give." Clara found herself genuinely interested, asking questions about preparation methods and seasonal availability, when she successfully identified an edible root on her own. Samuel's approving nod filled her with pride. But it was while gathering piñón nuts from a grove of trees that their lesson took an unexpected turn. Clara, stretching to reach a particularly full cone, lost her balance on the rocky slope. She cried out as she fell, expecting to hit hard ground, but strong arms caught her, pulling her against a solid chest. For a moment, they stayed frozen like that, Samuel holding her secure, Clara's hands gripping his shoulders. She could feel his heartbeat, rapid despite his eternal calm. Their eyes met, and something electric passed between them, an awareness that had been building for weeks but never acknowledged. Then Samuel set her carefully on her feet and stepped back, his expression unreadable once more. "Be careful," he said roughly. "I cannot always catch you." They finished gathering in silence, but the air between them had changed, charged with unspoken possibility. That change manifested in small ways over the following days. Samuel began teaching her to shoot his bow, standing behind her to adjust her stance, his breath warm on her neck. Clara found herself watching him as he worked, admiring the efficient grace of his movements, the way sunlight played across his bronze skin. One evening, as she struggled to repair a torn moccasin with an awl and sinew, Samuel sat beside her, closer than usual, and took the work from her hands. "Like this," he said, demonstrating the proper technique. Small stitches, very tight. Clara watched his hands, scarred but surprisingly gentle. "Work the leather. You do this better than many women I knew in town," she said, attempting levity. Samuel's mouth quirked in what might have been amusement. Apache men learn all skills. Never know when you will be alone. Need to do for yourself. "But you're not alone now," Clara said softly. He paused in his stitching, looking at her with those deep brown eyes. "No," he agreed. "Not alone." The moment stretched between them, full of possibility, before Samuel returned to his work. But that night, he didn't immediately leave the dwelling after the fire died down. Instead, he sat in the entrance, silhouetted against the stars. "Are you guarding against something?" Clara asked from her bed of furs. "Always guarding," Samuel replied. "It is the way of survival. Even from me?" A long pause. "Especially from you." Clara didn't know how to respond to that, so she lay quiet, but sleep wouldn't come. She was acutely aware of his presence, of the small sounds of his breathing, of the way the moonlight outlined his profile. The next test of their fragile partnership came in the form of a rattlesnake. Clara was gathering firewood near the dwelling when she heard the distinctive rattle. She froze, spotting the coiled serpent just feet away, its tail vibrating a deadly warning. "Samuel," she called, keeping her voice steady despite her terror. "Snake?" He appeared instantly, assessing the situation with a quick glance, moving with liquid precision. He used a long stick to pin the snake's head, then dispatched it with his knife. The entire action took seconds. "You did well," he said, noting her controlled response. "No panic, no sudden moves. You learn. I had a good teacher," Clara replied, still shaky from the encounter. Samuel skinned the snake with practiced efficiency. "We eat this tonight, waste nothing in the desert." He looked at her appraisingly. "You know, many white women would faint at such sight. Scream, run, make danger worse." "I'm not most white women," Clara said with a touch of her old defiance. "No," Samuel agreed, and there was something warm in his voice. "You are not." That night, as they ate the snake meat, which tasted surprisingly like chicken, Clara felt a shift in her perspective. The fear that had dominated her first weeks here was fading, replaced by respect for the land and growing confidence in her ability to survive it. And underneath that, something else was growing, an attraction to the man who had become her teacher, protector, and companion. But the lesson that changed everything came the next morning. Samuel announced they would hunt larger game. The dried meat supplies were running low, and they needed to replenish before the weather turned. He gave Clara a knife, showing her how to hold it properly. "If something happens to me, you must know how to defend yourself, how to survive alone." The thought of him being hurt or killed sent an unexpected spike of fear through her. "Nothing will happen to you," she said firmly. Samuel almost smiled. "You sound like wife now, not captive." The words hung between them, weighted with meaning. Clara felt heat rise in her cheeks, but she didn't deny it. When had she stopped thinking of herself as his prisoner? When had this sparse dwelling begun to feel like home? They tracked a small herd of deer through the morning, Samuel teaching her to read signs in the earth, to move silently, to understand the wind. When they finally got close enough, he raised his bow, then paused. "You try," he whispered, handing her the weapon. Clara's hands shook as she knocked the arrow, drew back the string. The deer was broadside, a clear shot, but her release was clumsy. The arrow flew wide, and the herd bolted. She expected disappointment, criticism. Instead, Samuel laughed, actually laughed, a rich sound she'd never heard from him before. "What's funny?" she demanded, embarrassed. "You," he said, still chuckling. "Face so serious, like going to war. Hunting is not anger, is patience. Come, we try again." But as they turned to follow the deer, Samuel suddenly pushed Clara behind him, his entire body tensing. Following his gaze, she saw what had alarmed him: fresh bear tracks, massive and deep, crossing their path. "We go back," he said quietly. "Now." They retreated carefully, Samuel keeping himself between Clara and the direction of the tracks. His protectiveness touched something deep in her chest. When they reached the safety of their valley, Clara impulsively caught his arm. "Thank you," she said, "for keeping me safe, for teaching me, for—" She struggled to find words for the gratitude and confusion and growing affection tangled in her heart. Samuel covered her hand with his. "You are my wife. Your safety is my life now." That evening, as Clara successfully cooked a stew from their gathered plants and remaining dried meat, she caught Samuel watching her with an expression she'd never seen before, something soft and wondering. "What?" she asked, suddenly self-conscious. "I see you happy," he said simply. "First time since you come here. It is good to see." Clara realized with surprise that he was right. Despite the hardships, the dangers, the complete upheaval of her life, she had found moments of genuine happiness here. The satisfaction of mastering a new skill, the beauty of sunrise over the mountains, the quiet companionship of evening meals, all had woven themselves into something approaching contentment. "I suppose I am," she admitted. "Happy, I mean, or at least—" She paused, searching for honesty. "Not unhappy?" It was enough. Samuel nodded, understanding in his eyes. That night, as had become his custom, he lingered in the dwelling after dark. But this time, when he rose to leave, Clara spoke. "Stay." He turned, his expression carefully neutral. "You sure?" Clara's heart hammered, but she nodded. "It gets cold at night, warmer with two." It was an excuse, and they both knew it. But Samuel spread his blanket on the opposite side of the fire pit, maintaining respectful distance even as he honored her request. As Clara drifted off to sleep, she was acutely aware of his presence, of the way the firelight played across his features, of the strange comfort in knowing he was near. The desert night sang its ancient songs outside, wind through stone, distant coyotes, the whisper of wings overhead. But inside the dwelling, a different kind of music was beginning, the tentative harmony of two lonely souls finding solace in each other's company. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as Clara worked at the stream, washing clothes in the old ways Samuel had taught her, beating them against the rocks, scrubbing with yucca root that foamed like soap. She had grown strong in the months since her arrival, her hands calloused but capable, her movements sure. She was so focused on her task that she didn't hear the horses until they were nearly upon her. Looking up, her blood ran cold. 3 white men sat astride their mounts, watching her with expressions that ranged from curiosity to contempt. "Well, well," the leader said, a grizzled man with tobacco-stained teeth. "What have we here? Little white girl playing Indian?" Clara stood slowly, acutely aware of her Apache dress, her sun-darkened skin, the beaded ornaments in her hair. She gripped the wet clothing against her chest like a shield. "I'd heard tell there was a squaw man up in these mountains," another rider said, younger, with mean eyes that traveled over Clara in a way that made her skin crawl. Didn't believe it till now. Look at her, dressed up like a savage. "Please," Clara said, hating how her voice shook. "Just leave. We want no trouble." The leader spat tobacco juice near her feet. "We? You mean you and your red buck? Where is he, girl? Out hunting while his white woman does the wash." "Shameful," the third man added, shaking his head in theatrical disgust. "A Christian woman, living in sin with a heathen. Your family must be rolling in their graves." "They sold me!" Clara burst out before she could stop herself. For a horse, so don't talk to me about shame." The younger man laughed. An ugly sound. "Sold you? Well, that makes sense then. Damaged goods already. Though I bet we could still find a use for you, once we deal with your Apache." Fear spiked through Clara's chest. "You leave him alone. He's done nothing wrong." "Nothing wrong?" The leader's voice hardened. "These mountains are for white folks. Girl. Not for Indians who steal our women and—" An arrow thudded into the ground inches from his horse's hooves. The animal reared, nearly unseating him. Samuel stood on the ridge above. Another arrow already knocked, his expression deadly calm. The woman said, "Leave." He called down. "I say same. Once." The men reached for their guns, but Samuel's bow was already drawn. "You shoot, you die," he said simply. "Maybe you kill me too, maybe not. Want to find out?" The leader controlled his horse, his face flushed with anger. "You threatening white men, boy? I protect what is mine," Samuel replied, as any man would. A tense standoff stretched between them. Clara held her breath, knowing how quickly violence could erupt. Finally, the leader spat again and turned his horse. "This ain't over," he said. "The army's gonna hear about this. An Apache threatening decent folk? They'll come for you, savage, and when they do, we'll see who protects who." The three men rode off, their laughter and crude comments echoing off the canyon walls. Clara's legs gave out and she sank to the ground, shaking. Samuel was beside her in moments, his hands gentle as he helped her stand. "Did they hurt you?" he asked, his eyes scanning her for injury. "No," Clara managed. "But Samuel, what they said about the army." "Empty threats," he said, but she caught the flicker of concern in his eyes. "Come, we go back." That evening, Clara couldn't eat. The encounter had shaken something loose in her. All the fears and prejudices she'd been raised with came flooding back. She caught herself looking at Samuel differently, seeing him through the eyes of those men. Savage, heathen. The words echoed in her mind. "You think they're words," Samuel said quietly, reading her as he always could. Clara flushed with shame. "I don't mean to. It's just—" "All my life, I was taught. I know what you were taught," Samuel interrupted, his voice bitter. "Same words they used when they killed my mother, when they drove my people from our lands. Words to make us less than human. So taking from us feels right." "But you're not less than human," Clara protested. "You're—" She struggled to articulate what he'd become to her. Teacher, protector, companion. Something more she wasn't ready to name. "I am Apache," Samuel said simply. "To them is same as animal. And you, living with me," he shook his head. "To them, you are worse than animal. You are traitor to your blood." The harsh truth of it sat between them like a physical presence. Clara thought of her life in town, the church socials, the proper courtships, the narrow boundaries of acceptable behavior. All of it lost to her now, as surely as if she'd died. "Do you regret it?" she asked suddenly. "Trading for me, bringing this trouble?" Samuel looked at her for a long moment. "Do you regret learning to survive? Finding strength you didn't know? Being free of father who would sell you?" "That's not an answer. Is only answer that matters." He stood, pacing to the dwelling entrance. "Tomorrow, I teach you to hide, where to go if men come back, how to disappear in mountains. What about you?" "I will do what I must to protect my wife." The words sent a shiver through Clara. Wife. Despite living here for months, despite sharing the dwelling, though still with careful distance between them, she rarely thought of herself in those terms. But hearing it now, after facing those men's contempt, she felt something shift inside her. That night, Clara lay awake long after the fire died to embers. Through the dwelling entrance, she could see Samuel keeping watch, his silhouette alert against the stars. Protector, guardian, husband in name if not yet in truth. Moving quietly, she rose and approached him, wrapping a blanket around her shoulders against the cool night air. He glanced at her but didn't speak, making room for her to sit beside him. "Can't sleep," she explained unnecessarily. "Fear is loud," he acknowledged. makes rest difficult. They sat in companionable silence, watching clouds drift across the moon. Finally, Clara found courage to voice what had been building in her heart. "I'm not sorry," she said quietly. "Whatever those men think, whatever I've lost, I'm not sorry to be here, to be—" She swallowed hard. "To be yours." Samuel turned to look at her, his dark eyes unreadable in the moonlight. Slowly, giving her time to pull away, he reached out and touched her face. His fingers were calloused but gentle, tracing the line of her cheek with reverence. "Clara," he said, and her name on his lips was like a prayer. "You honor me." The space between them seemed to shrink, pulled by forces older than prejudice or fear. Clara leaned into his touch, her heart racing. When Samuel lowered his head toward hers, she met him halfway. The kiss was tentative at first, a question asked and answered. Then Clara's arms came up around his neck, and Samuel pulled her closer. And the careful distance they'd maintained for months dissolved like morning mist. When they finally parted, both breathing unsteadily, Samuel rested his forehead against hers. "You sure?" he asked, echoing his question from weeks ago. But this time, the meaning was different, deeper. "Yes," Clara whispered. "I'm sure." He stood, drawing her up with him, and led her back into the dwelling. The bed of furs that had seemed so foreign months ago now felt like home, especially with Samuel beside her. He was gentle, patient, treating her with a tenderness that made her eyes sting with unshed tears. Later, as they lay entwined, Clara traced the scar on his cheek. Will they really come? The army? Perhaps, Samuel admitted. But tonight, we don't think of that. Tonight, we are only us. Clara pressed closer to him, feeling safe despite the dangers that lurked beyond their hidden valley. The contempt of those men still stung, but it had also clarified something vital. Let them call her ruined, fallen, traitor to her race. She'd found something here worth more than their approval, strength, partnership, and now, love. "My wife," Samuel murmured against her hair, and the words were a vow. "My husband," Clara replied, sealing their truth with another kiss. Outside, coyotes sang to the desert moon, and the ancient mountains stood witness to love that bloomed despite, or perhaps because of, all the forces arrayed against it. In the morning, they would prepare for whatever threats might come, but for now, in the shelter of Samuel's arms. Clara allowed herself to believe that love might be stronger than hate, that two outcasts might forge a life worth living from the harsh beauty of this unforgiving land. The words that had once been her shame transformed in the darkness, and endless nights in the Apache's arms became not a curse, but a promise. Not captivity, but freedom. Not an ending, but a beginning. The letter came with a traveling merchant who sometimes traded with Samuel, a grizzled old man named Josiah, who knew enough to find their hidden valley. Clara was grinding corn when she heard the horses, and her heart leaped with the familiar mix of hope and dread that accompanied any contact with the outside world. "Got something for the lady," Josiah said, eyeing Clara with curiosity but no judgment. He'd been trading with Samuel for years and asked no questions. "Fellow in Bitter Creek paid me to bring it up." Clara took the crumpled envelope with trembling hands. Her name was scrawled across it in unfamiliar writing. Samuel stood nearby, watchful and tense. "Bad news travels on paper," he said quietly after Josiah left. Clara opened the letter, her eyes scanning the cramped writing. The words hit her like physical blows, and she sank onto a stone, the paper fluttering from nerveless fingers. "My parents," she whispered. "They're dead. Cholera took them both last month." Samuel knelt beside her, not touching but present. Clara felt hollow, scraped clean by a grief more complex than simple sorrow. These were the people who had sold her, yet they were still her blood, her beginnings. "The house is abandoned," she continued numbly. "Everything sold for debts. There's nothing left. You have home here," Samuel reminded her gently. Clara laughed, a broken sound. "Do I? I'm neither white nor Apache, neither daughter nor truly wife. I'm nothing. You are Clara." Samuel said firmly. Strong woman who survived, who learned, who chose love over fear. That is not nothing. She looked at him through tears. This man who had bought her like livestock yet treated her like a treasure. The irony wasn't lost on her. Her parents had sold her to save themselves, yet died anyway, while she lived on in the arms of the man they'd despised. That night, Samuel held her as she grieved, not just for her parents, but for the life she'd never return to, the person she'd never again be. He sang softly in Apache, words she didn't understand but that soothed nonetheless. I should feel guilty, Clara confessed into the darkness. They died alone, probably cursing my name, but all I feel is free. Does that make me terrible? Makes you honest, Samuel replied. Dead chains still chains. Now you choose, mourn what was or build what is. The next morning brought new troubles. Samuel returned from checking his trap lines with a grim expression. Riders in the lower valley. 6, maybe 7. Moving careful. Watching. The army? Clara asked, fear spiking through her chest. No uniforms? Bounty hunters? Maybe? His jaw tightened. They look for someone. Clara's mind raced. Those men from the stream, had they made good on their threats? Or was this about Samuel's past, the soldier he'd killed defending his mother's land? We need to hide, she said. No. Samuel's voice was flat. I don't run from my home. You go to the cave I showed you. Take supplies for 3 days. I'm not leaving you, Clara protested. You must. If they take me... He gripped her shoulders. You know these mountains now. You can survive. Go to Josiah. He will help you reach somewhere safe. Safe! Clara pulled away, angry. Where is safe for me now? Town, where they'll call me ruined. Another man who'll use me worse because I'm already damaged goods. Better than dead, Samuel said harshly. No, Clara said, surprising herself with her vehemence. It's not, I'd rather die as your wife than live as their shame. Something shifted in Samuel's expression. He pulled her close, kissing her fiercely. Stubborn woman, he murmured. Then we faced them together. They spent the day preparing, weapons cleaned and ready, water stored in hidden caches, escape routes planned. As the sun set, painting the sky in shades of blood, the riders appeared at the valley entrance. Clara recognized the leader, a notorious bounty hunter named Jake Morrison. His reputation was dark, built on bringing in Apache scalps for Mexican bounties. Behind him rode hard men with harder eyes. Samuel Crowfeather, Morrison called out. I know you're up there. Come out peaceful-like, and the woman doesn't have to watch you die. What is your business? Samuel called back, though they both knew the answer. Got paper on you from the army. Says you killed a Sergeant Baker 5 years back, worth good money, dead or alive. Morrison grinned. Course, dead is easier to transport. Clara felt Samuel tense beside her. Baker, she knew that name. Samuel had told her about the sergeant who'd led the raid on his mother's camp, who'd shot her as she tried to protect their sacred grounds. Baker was a murderer. Clara shouted before Samuel could stop her. He killed innocent women and children. Morrison laughed. Well, looks like you got yourself a regular little Apache lover there. Crowfeather, don't worry, sweetheart. Sure, we can find someone to take you off our hands once we're done here. Plenty of men like their women pre-broken. The crude threat snapped something in Clara. Before Samuel could react, she grabbed his rifle and fired. The shot took Morrison's hat clean off, demonstrating marksmanship Samuel had patiently taught her. Next one goes lower, she called, working the lever to chamber another round. My husband fought for his land and family. What do you fight for? Money? Blood sport? The hunters scrambled for cover, clearly not expecting resistance from the woman. In the chaos, Samuel pulled Clara behind the natural rock barricade they'd prepared. Brave but foolish, he said, though pride flickered in his eyes. I won't let them take you, Clara said fiercely. Not for something that wasn't even wrong. The standoff stretched through the night. Morrison's men tried to flank them twice, But Samuel's knowledge of the terrain and Clara's unexpected skill with a rifle drove them back. As dawn approached, Morrison tried a different tactic. "Girl," he called. "You know what he is? Not just a killer, but a savage who'll never fit in civilized society. You stay with him, you'll die with him. Today, tomorrow, someday. That what you want?" Clara thought of her parents, dying of disease in their proper town with their proper prejudices. She thought of the life she might have had, married to some farmer or shopkeeper, bearing children in a world that would always see her as less than her husband, trapped in the narrow confines of acceptable womanhood. "You're right," she called back, and felt Samuel stiffen beside her. "He'll never fit in your civilization. Neither will I, not anymore. But out here," she gestured at the vast wilderness around them. "Out here, we're free, we're alive, we're together. That's worth more than your blood money or your approval. Your choice." Morrison snarled. "Boys, burn them out!" But before they could act on the threat, new riders appeared on the ridge. Josiah and 3 other traders, all armed, all frowning down at Morrison's group. "This here's a peaceful valley," Josiah announced. "Man wants to trade and live quiet. That's his right. You boys best move along before this gets messy." Morrison looked between the defenders above and the new arrivals. The math had shifted against him. "This ain't over," he promised, but he signaled his men to withdraw. As the hunters disappeared into the desert, Clara sagged against Samuel, adrenaline leaving her shaky. "Will they come back?" "Perhaps," Samuel said. "But Josiah's intervention will make them think, and now they know you shoot straight." That evening, as they sat by their fire, Clara stared into the flames. "I could have gotten us killed," she said quietly. "Acting on anger, on pride." "You acted on love," Samuel corrected. "On justice. My mother would have liked you very much." Clara leaned against him, feeling the solid warmth of his presence. "I meant what I said, about choosing this, choosing you, even knowing what it costs." "The cost is high," Samuel agreed. "But the reward," he kissed her temple, "the reward is worth any price." They made love that night with a desperate passion, both aware how close they'd come to losing everything. In the aftermath, as Clara lay in Samuel's arms, she thought about the letter, about her parents' deaths, about Morrison's threats. "I have no people now," she murmured. "No family, no place in the white world." "You have me," Samuel said simply, "and I have you. We make our own people, our own world." It wasn't enough to erase the grief or fear, but it was a start. Outside, the desert wind sang through the canyons, carrying away the smoke of the day's violence. Inside, 2 outcasts held each other against the darkness, building a life from love and stubborn determination. Clara dozed, her last thought a prayer to whatever spirits watched over this wild land. "Let us have time. Let us have peace. Let us have each other for whatever days remain." The pursuit came 3 days later. Morrison had regrouped, bringing more men and a grim determination that spoke of wounded pride as much as bounty money. Clara spotted the dust cloud from their position on the high ridge where Samuel had taken them after abandoning the valley. 12 riders, Samuel confirmed, lowering the field glasses Josiah had left them. "They track well." They'd been moving since dawn, using every trick Samuel knew to throw off pursuit, doubling back, walking in streams, using rock passages that left no prints. But Morrison was no amateur, and the desert had few secrets from determined hunters. "The canyon?" Clara suggested, pointing to a narrow defile that cut through the mountains ahead. Samuel nodded. "Good for defense, bad for escape. Then we make our stand there." They pushed the horses hard, reaching the canyon as the sun peaked. It was a good position, high walls, limited approaches, a spring-fed pool for water. Samuel immediately began preparing defensive positions while Clara tended the exhausted horses. "They'll try to wait us out," Samuel predicted. "Hunger and thirst are better weapons than bullets." "Then we make them impatient," Clara said, checking her rifle. The weapon had become an extension of herself. as familiar as the kitchen knives she'd once used in her father's house. Morrison's gang appeared at the canyon mouth near sunset, spreading out in practiced formation. Clara could see they'd learned from the previous encounter. No bunching up, no easy targets. "Crow feather," Morrison's voice echoed off the canyon walls. "Last chance, send out the woman and surrender. I'll make it quick." "Counteroffer," Clara called back, her voice steady despite her racing heart. "You leave now, and I don't put a bullet through your other ear." She punctuated the threat with a shot that sparked off the rocks inches from Morrison's head. The man dove for cover, cursing. "Damn hellcat," one of his men shouted. "Jake, she ain't worth." The man's protest cut off in a gurgle. Clara watched in horror as he toppled from his horse. One of Samuel's arrows protruding from his throat. First blood had been spilled, changing everything. The canyon erupted in gunfire. Clara and Samuel had chosen their positions well, with overlapping fields of fire and good cover. But they were badly outnumbered, and Morrison's men were experienced fighters. As darkness fell, the shooting became sporadic, both sides conserving ammunition. Clara's hands were steady on her rifle, but her mind raced. In town, she'd never imagined herself capable of violence. Now she aimed and fired with deadly intent, protecting what was hers. "You fight like Apache," Samuel said during a lull, approval warm in his voice. "I fight like a woman defending her home," Clara corrected, though she smiled grimly. The night brought new challenges. Morrison sent men to scale the canyon walls, trying to get above them. Samuel seemed to have eyes in the darkness, picking off climbers with thrown knives and well-placed arrows. Clara covered the main approach, firing at muzzle flashes and moving positions to confuse return fire. Near dawn, exhausted and running low on ammunition, they heard Morrison organizing what sounded like a final assault. Clara looked at Samuel, seeing her own thoughts reflected in his eyes. They'd fought well, but the odds were catching up. "I love you," she said simply, reaching for his hand. "And I love you," Samuel replied, squeezing her fingers. "Whatever comes, we face together." The attack came from 3 directions at once. Clara fired until her rifle clicked empty, then drew the pistol Samuel had given her, beside her. Samuel's bow sang its deadly song. Men fell, but more kept coming, just as their position was about to be overrun. New gunfire erupted from the canyon rim. Clara looked up to see figures silhouetted against the lightening sky. Apache warriors, painted for battle, rifles crackling as they fired down on Morrison's exposed men. The hunters, caught in a crossfire, broke and ran. Morrison himself took an arrow in the shoulder but managed to stay mounted, leading his remaining men in a desperate flight from the canyon. As the dust settled, one of the Apache warriors descended to their position. He was young, perhaps 25, with intelligent eyes that studied Clara with frank curiosity. "Samuel Crowfeather," he said in accented English. "The old woman dreams of you, says you need help." Samuel spoke rapidly in Apache, and the warrior nodded. More fighters appeared, gathering the weapons and supplies the hunters had abandoned. "This is Robert Two Hawks," Samuel told Clara. "His grandmother was my mother's friend." "The white woman who shoots straight," Robert said, inclining his head to Clara. "The old woman dreams of you, too. Says you have Apache heart and white skin." Clara didn't know how to respond to that, so she simply nodded. The warriors made camp in the canyon, tending wounds and sharing food. Clara found herself accepted with surprising ease, the fighters treating her as Samuel's wife without question or judgment. "Your people," she said to Samuel quietly. "I thought you had no one." "I thought so too," Samuel admitted. "But blood calls to blood, even across years of silence." Robert approached them as the sun climbed higher. "The hunters will return. Bring army, maybe. This place is known now, not safe." "Where can we go?" Clara asked, though she suspected the answer. "The old woman says come to the mountains in Mexico, Apache land, where white law doesn't reach. You would be welcome." Clara felt torn. Part of her yearned for the safety of a community that would accept them, but another part rebelled at running again, at being driven from the home they'd built. "We need time to think," Samuel said diplomatically. Robert nodded. "We watch the trails for 3 days. Decide by then." He paused, looking at Clara. "The old woman also says the white woman carries new life, Apache child growing in white womb. This is powerful medicine." Clara's hand flew to her stomach. She'd suspected for weeks but hadn't been certain. Samuel's eyes widened, a mix of joy and fear crossing his face. "A child," he breathed. After the Apache warriors departed to their watch positions, Clara and Samuel sat by the pool, processing this new reality. "Changes everything," Samuel said quietly. "Child needs safety. Community. Our child." Clara said firmly, "Yours and mine, neither white nor Apache, but both. Hardest path," Samuel warned. "Belonging nowhere full." Clara thought of her own journey, from the terrified girl traded for a horse to the woman who stood with a rifle defending her chosen life. Or belonging everywhere. She countered, "Making our own place." They spent the 3 days recovering and planning. Clara practiced with the Apache women who'd accompanied the warriors, learning new skills and plant medicines specific to pregnancy. The easy acceptance she found among them was a revelation after months of isolation. On the third dawn, Morrison appeared again at the canyon mouth, but this time with blue-uniformed cavalry. Clara counted at least 30 soldiers, their brass buttons glinting in the morning sun. "Federal warrant," the officer called. "Samuel Crowfeather, you are under arrest for the murder of Sergeant William Baker. Surrender peacefully, and the woman will not be harmed." Clara felt Samuel tense beside her. This was different from bounty hunters. The army had resources, reach, relentless pursuit. And now, with a child coming. "What would the old woman say?" Clara asked Robert, who'd materialized beside them like smoke. Robert smiled slightly. "She says the eagle does not ask the mountain for permission to fly. Make your choice, then make it right." Clara looked at Samuel, seeing her own resolve reflected in his eyes. They'd fought too hard, come too far, to surrender now. She placed her hand over her still flat stomach, where their child grew. A new life that deserved freedom, not the shadow of gallows or the shame of mixed blood in a world that demanded purity. "We go with you," Samuel told Robert. "To Mexico, to your people. Our people now," Robert corrected, glancing meaningfully at Clara. "The old woman has spoken." As they prepared to slip away through secret paths the Apache knew, Clara took one last look at the approaching soldiers. Among them, she spotted a familiar figure, the young lieutenant from Bitter Creek who'd once courted her properly. Bringing flowers and stammering compliments, their eyes met across the distance, and she saw his shock at her transformation. Let him report back that Clara Mason was dead. She thought, in truth, that frightened girl was gone. In her place stood something stronger, wife, warrior, soon-to-be mother, a woman who'd chosen love over safety, freedom over acceptance. "Ready?" Samuel asked, extending his hand. Clara took it without hesitation. "Always." They melted into the landscape with the Apache, leaving behind the narrow world that would never accept them for the vast possibility of a life lived on their own terms. Behind them, soldiers shouted and searched, but the desert kept its secrets. Ahead lay unknown challenges, but Clara faced them without fear. She'd been traded for a horse. Yes, but in losing everything, she'd found herself, found love, found a strength she'd never known she possessed, and now, with the new life growing within her, she rode toward a future written in neither white law nor Apache tradition, but in the fierce love of two people who'd made their own world in the harsh beauty of the wilderness. Winter came to the Mexican mountains with a vengeance, blanketing the Apache camp in snow that transformed the landscape into something ethereal and dangerous. Clara, now heavy with child, moved carefully through the pristine drifts, marveling at how different this winter was from those she'd known in Arizona. The camp had welcomed them with cautious warmth. The old woman Robert had spoken of, Maria Singing Crow, had indeed dreamed of them, declaring their arrival as the fulfillment of a vision. She was ancient, her face mapped with wrinkles, but her eyes held a sharpness that seemed to see through time itself. "The child you carry," Maria had told Clara through Robert's translation, "will walk in both worlds. Neither cage nor chain will hold such a spirit." Now, months later, Clara had found her place among the people. Her white skin no longer marked her as outsider, her skill with rifle and herbs, her devotion to Samuel, and the obvious love between them had earned respect that transcended blood. She paused in her gathering of winter medicines, one hand supporting her swollen belly as the baby kicked vigorously. Samuel appeared at her side instantly, ever watchful as her time approached. "You should rest," he said, the same words he'd spoken every day for the past month. "Movement is good," Clara replied, echoing what the Apache women had taught her. "Your child is strong, wants to meet the world." Samuel's hand joined hers on her belly, his touch reverent. In the months since their flight from the canyon, he'd changed too. Among his mother's people, he'd found a peace she'd never seen in him before. The constant vigilance remained, but it no longer carried the edge of a man alone against the world. That evening, as snow began falling again, Clara felt the first pains. She'd helped with births in Bitter Creek, knew the signs, but experiencing them herself was different. Samuel's calm cracked for the first time she'd ever seen, his hands actually trembling as he helped her to their shelter. The Apache women took charge, shooing Samuel out with gentle firmness. Maria Singing Crow herself attended, despite her age, declaring this birth too important to leave to younger hands. The labor was long, stretching through the night and into the next day. Clara heard Samuel pacing outside, heard his voice raised in prayer, sometimes in English, sometimes in Apache, always desperate. She wanted to call out to him, to ease his worry, but the work of bringing life into the world consumed everything. When the baby finally came, Clara understood why Maria had called the child special. Her daughter, their daughter, announced herself with a cry that seemed to echo off the mountains themselves. Strong and defiant. "Let the father come," Maria commanded, and Samuel burst in, his composure completely shattered by joy and relief. "A girl," Clara whispered, exhausted but triumphant. "Our daughter." Samuel knelt beside them, his scarred warrior's hands impossibly gentle as he touched the baby's head. She had his dark hair but Clara's lighter skin, her features a perfect blend of both parents. "What do we call her?" Clara asked. "Sarah," Samuel said without hesitation. "My mother's American name, Sarah Whitefeather, for both her bloods." Maria nodded approval. "She will need both strengths. The world changes, and she must change with it." As winter deepened, Clara settled into the rhythms of motherhood. Sarah was an easy baby, alert and curious, seeming to study the world with unusual intensity. The camp's children were fascinated by her mixed features, and she became something of a communal child, passed from arms to arms, beloved by all. But even in this sanctuary, the outside world intruded. Scouts brought word of increased army patrols, of Mexican soldiers paid by Americans to hunt Apache camps. The fragile peace that had sheltered them grew thinner with each passing week. One night, as Clara nursed Sarah by the fire, Samuel sat beside her with troubled eyes. "Robert says we must move again," he said quietly. "Deeper into the mountains. Or," he paused, struggling with words, "or north. He knows people who help, a mission in California where mixed families can disappear, start new." Clara looked down at their daughter, seeing in her innocent face all the challenges that awaited her. In the Apache camp, Sarah was accepted, even celebrated. But Clara knew this protection was temporary. The world beyond would demand Sarah choose a side, would punish her for being both and neither. "What do you want?" Clara asked Samuel. "To give her choices we never had," he replied. "To read, write, learn both ways of knowing. To walk in the white world without shame, but know her Apache heart." Clara understood. The mission meant giving up the warrior's life, meant Samuel working farms or ranches, meant her pretending to be something she wasn't. a proper Christian woman rather than a fighter who'd stood with rifle in hand defending her chosen life. But for Sarah, when? She asked simply. Spring, when the pass is clear. They spent the remaining winter months preparing. Clara learned everything she could from Maria singing crow. Medicines, stories, the women's ceremonies she could pass to her daughter. Samuel taught her more Apache words, ensuring Sarah would hear both languages from birth. The night before their departure, the camp held a ceremony. Sarah was blessed by Maria, given an Apache name, Morning Star Between Worlds, and wrapped in a blanket woven with prayers for protection. Clara wept at the beauty of it, at the community they were leaving behind. You always have place here, Maria told them through Robert. When the world is too heavy, the mountains remember. They left at dawn, a small party for safety. Samuel and Clara, baby Sarah, and 2 young Apache men who would guide them to the mission before returning. Clara rode carefully, Sarah bound to her chest in a cradleboard, feeling the weight of another journey into the unknown. They traveled for 2 weeks, avoiding towns, skirting patrols, becoming shadows in a landscape increasingly hostile to their existence. At night, Clara would hold Sarah close and whisper stories about the grandfather who'd sold her mother for a horse but inadvertently given her freedom, about the grandmother who'd been a medicine woman, about the mountains that had sheltered their love. When they finally reached the mission, a sprawling adobe compound in a valley green with cultivation, Clara felt the same mixture of hope and loss that had marked every transition in her strange life. The priest, Father Miguel, asked no questions about their clearly mixed union, simply offering them work and shelter in exchange for conversion and labor. Can you do this? Clara asked Samuel as they stood before their small, allocated cottage. Pretend to be what they want. I have been 2 things all my life. Samuel replied, Now I be 3, Apache, white, and whatever keeps our daughter safe. That first night in their new home, solid walls, glass windows, a proper bed. Clara lay awake listening to Sarah's breathing. She thought of all the miles traveled, all the selves shed and claimed, from terrified girl to desert survivor, from purchased bride to chosen wife, from fighter to mother. Samuel stirred beside her, sensing her wakefulness. Regrets? He asked. Clara turned to face him, seeing in the moonlight through the window the same man who'd bought her for a horse, taught her to survive, loved her without condition, given her a child who embodied hope itself. Never, she said, meaning it. At 18, I was traded for a horse, but that wasn't my ending. It was my beginning. Samuel pulled her close, careful of Sarah sleeping between them. Outside, coyotes called in the distant hills, a reminder of the wild they'd left but would always carry within. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, learning to be servants when they'd been free, teaching Sarah to navigate a world that would question her very existence. But tonight, in this small sanctuary carved from an unforgiving world, they were simply family. Clara closed her eyes, one hand on her daughter, the other linked with her husband's scarred fingers. Whatever tomorrow brought, they would face it together, no longer Apache or white, captive or warrior, but something new entirely. Survivors, partners, parents, free, inner sleep. Sarah made a small sound of contentment, as if agreeing with her mother's thoughts. And in that moment, Clara knew with bone-deep certainty that every hardship, every loss, every mile of their journey had been worth it for this, the quiet breathing of their daughter, the solid presence of Samuel beside her, the future spreading before them like an unwritten page. She smiled in the darkness, whispering once more the words that had become not curse but blessing. At 18, I was traded to a solitary Apache for a horse, and in his arms, I found my life. Thank you for joining me on this incredible journey through the Wild West. If you're listening to this story, I'd love to know where in the world you're tuning in from. Please share in the comments below. Don't forget to subscribe to From Wild West channel for more authentic tales of love, survival, and adventure from America's frontier days. What did you think of Clara and Samuel's story? Share your thoughts in the comments. I read every one and love connecting with fellow Western romance enthusiasts.